Hey, hello and welcome to this video that I've titled something related to bevels. But actually we're getting into a lot of technical details here. I'm hopefully going to provide verbal examples of when these different edges should be used. I'm going to try and display them also as well as possible. But it's not my style of video to make these flashy meme edits. So hopefully you can get the information out of this video that you need. It's all going to be really useful stuff, and I do think a lot of this is important and not necessarily considered even by senior artists, because it's very easy to forget the baseline of what meshes you need to create for game engines. And this does refer to game engines. A lot of it is also going to refer to Nanite and Unreal Engine. And so I think all this information is really useful, and hopefully I get that across in the video. So we're going to start with a cube, because it's just a mesh that we want to look at. And I'm in Blender. Oh, actually, I'm in the wrong. Oh, yeah, I'm in the right one here. But I've not got my add-ons, which can help with some of these scenarios. I've not used Blender 4.1 enough because the whole. Actually, no, I am in the wrong one. But I've not used Blender 4.1 and 4.2 enough because of the new edge system that they've got in there. It makes the stuff surrounding bevels, when you want to apply sharp edges and seams, it makes it a lot more difficult and less automated. So we'll struggle with some of that throughout the video. And yeah, we're just going to talk about bevels. We're mainly going to get into normals and baking towards the end, but that all sort of falls in with the kind of bevels that you're going to want to add to a mesh anyway. So, I mean, technically a single bevel, I think, is a chamfer, but in Blender it's just a bevel tool and it's all called bevels anyway, so this would technically be a bevel. If I add another cube that is just like that, and I duplicate this one, then what we're going to add next to this one is a weighted normal modifier. Kind of want it to be shade smooth by angle, but again, Blender 4.1 that I'm in right now does not make that very easy, so smooth by angle is going to help out when you come into the more advanced examples later on. And you want to keep sharp on that because you want to make sure that anything you do want to be sharp remains as sharp. But we're going to be getting into those sharp edges quite quickly here. So the first thing to mention is this basic cube is quite obviously, as you can see on the bottom of my screen, it's quite obviously 8 vertices. The ones across the top and the ones across the bottom. It's also technically 6 faces and 12 edges, but we're going to pretty much ignore the edges because I don't think Unreal shows them in the asset browser. I couldn't also be bothered to open Unreal, but hopefully again we can talk about that kind of stuff with Blender examples. This one here is 24 and this one's also 24. So if you were modeling for a low poly art style, either of these two might be the ones you go with, but if you were baking down to a curved mesh, you know that you need to apply seams to the model. So this one would technically be all seams, and because if you want to bake either of these beveled meshes to this straight mesh one to try and fake the edges, because this one is technically lower polygon, you'd have to mark seams. But you wouldn't only be marking seams because you wouldn't mark them quite like how I have. That's just what it physically is going to end up like. What you'd probably actually do is, to be able to bake bevels down to this cube, you're going to need to add a split to each edge. And so technically why that is, we'll get into. It's old information that you probably don't need anymore, because you're going to probably be modeling with a higher polygon model. But knowing why you have to do it is going to be important. So what we've just done is I basically just applied those seams because I hadn't unwrapped the model. I applied the seams to the mesh as it is laid out. because this layout is also going to be quite easy to work with and easy to know. So we've broken all those edges, but physically in Blender, those vertices are still connected together, because modeling it, if they were all split up, would be a nightmare. So, but when we actually, because this is also flat shaded, when it's exported to a game engine, it's going to basically split all those faces. So it's still rendering the same amount of polygons, because game engines render triangles and then polygons and then all this kind of other stuff. But the vertex count, if you export it to Unreal Engine, you can open the model and it's not going to tell you 8 vertices as you see here. It's going to tell you, if I duplicate this and add an edge split, this model here, which is actually separate faces, is more like what you'd have in the game engine with sharp edges. So technically, with those seams that I've applied on every edge and the sharp edges that I've got on every edge, the model's being split up and broken up more and more and more. So when I talk about, whereas you might say this is a lower poly model, and I'm going to bake down the bevels onto these sharp 90-degree edges, which isn't ideal either. You're creating a model that has technically 24 vertices, as you can see at the bottom of my screen. And so this one here is actually going to be a crazy amount more because it's also flat shaded. I just duplicated it in edit mode. So this one's also flat shaded, so I'm going to add an edge split to that. And it's made out of 96 vertices. So when you start talking about this at the high polygon counts that modern assets have, that still makes, at the very least, a disk space memory impact, but it very likely also increases the model memory in game. And again, I'm not super technical on it, but it's very likely that it will. And it will also increase the, it might increase the loading times for that model because it's a lot more vertices than you necessarily thought when you were modeling it. So, talking about why I'd want to, let's just take that one and hide that one. If I was beveling a high poly model to bake onto this low poly one, just to talk about how this works, each edge has, we don't need UV viewport anymore to be fair. Each edge here has its own normal, each vertex. So if I can just preview that with the split normals here, you can see that each vertex on this model has a line coming from it, which is parallel to the face normal. You see how they're going straight out the normal? So I'll tell you how I learned some of this stuff, because it's not necessarily stuff that you're taught straight away. So it's all parallel to the face, there's the face normal there. And the reason that helps is, and you do want that face normal to be like that as well. The reason that helps is that if I expand this mesh, you can see that this edge fully aligns with where it was previously. So if you're baking the model, you split the edges for a bevel, because the cage is then going to expand. You might not see that kind of stuff, but it's going to expand like this, and it's going to cast rays straight across, and it still remains parallel to the original mesh. So this model, even though it's expanded way above the cube underneath, it would bake those bevels perfectly because it doesn't care about distance, which is important. And so, yeah, that's just all important to say that that method of doing bevels, whereas it might appear cheaper on the model, we actually already know that this one over here is kind of the same amount of vertices, but contained into one whole mesh. And when we look at that sort of stuff on this model here, and we start thinking about nanite, Well, nanite technically also, where you apply UV seams and sharp edges, nanite also technically sees the mesh like this. So I could have a super subdivided face on this side, and nanite would crush those vertices and collapse them based on them being smaller and smaller on screen, and it would make the mesh lower poly overall. But you can see that one that I hit on the edge, it affected the edge. So nanite wouldn't do that, it would just take that edge and it would collapse it inwards like that. And it will never cross the lines of the seams or the lines of the flat sharp edges that you've applied. So again, a model like this in nanite might technically be cheaper than a model like this, which is all flat shaded. And that's the basis of like the oldest form of beveling, which would be low poly mesh, bevel, the high poly mesh, and bake those down. We don't have to worry about that anymore, pretty much. So I'm going to ignore those and just focus on the weighted normal version. But the weighted normal version also has issues. If I can get the right settings here. The weighted normal one looks really good whenever you're looking at the mesh from a straight on angle. And again, this new method is going to annoy me, but there we go, sharp. So this is like a mesh coming out of a wall, and this edge around here that I just marked sharp, unless it's got like a weld around it, I really don't see any issue with interior mesh edges being sharp, like too sharp, more sharp than they normally would be in real life, because that's like infinitely sharp right there. The issue is that the connecting point, you can see that there's just one edge there. But if I'm looking at it head on, at this front bevel, then I can't tell that there are no polygons between that. The issue just persists more and more as I start viewing this from a glancing angle, and I can see that there's only a flat edge there. So depending on what kind of game you're making, that's not an issue. But if you want a higher quality model, then you might consider just having a proper bevel on, even in this case, if the character's taller than the mesh, you might consider having the proper bevel on any mesh face that is facing upwards, as you can see, because the bottom one, I'm not going to be crouching down low enough to see that it's not made of more polygons. But the top one, if it's aligning with the camera, you want to be able to know that it's a rounded edge. And so in this case, if I'm not bothered about these ones that connect to the wall, then having a more detailed bevel towards the front and then having less detailed bevels towards the back is going to be a lot better. But there's also a few other types of details that kind of fall outside of bevels, but I'm going to treat them as part of this bevel video because it does relate to normals. The main way that I learned some of this is there was a mesh something along the lines of like this. And when this technically would bake, if I had a detail on the face here that was inset and it was all shaded sort of auto smooth at this point, which again I hate in this version of Blender, then it's potential that the face here, because you can see those normals are slanted, which means that anything it's rendering in this sort of area is going to render skewed. And I learned that from Marmoset Toolbag because their preview for baking is a lot stronger than most. And so you might want, potentially, that's why you might also want these to be marked as sharp. But again, maybe you just want to mark them sharp to bake that detail and sort of fix some other stuff later. But rather than marking sharp, which is going to add more faces, you could also consider a bevel, which is going to just nudge those side edges a lot less skewed for the bake. And yeah, so that's all sort of technical stuff around baking with bevels and how that works, because a sharp edge is probably going to be just as detailed. The other thing to consider again, and how we can use sharp edges with baking, which again is outside of the bevels, is that if I had a detail that's on the mesh, again I don't think I have my add-ons, so this isn't going to technically work, but if I bevel that vertex and try and turn this into a circle, which I'm not sure that it will, there we go. If I had a detail like this, and I wanted to bevel it onto a flat plane, then something like weighted normals again is going to help here. So weighted normals, just to get rid of those shading issues. Well, I've just had to do a ton of modeling, and that's potentially going to be on a larger mesh um, that isn't eventually going to have those details on, so they're getting removed on low poly. So I'm going to have my baked plane right above it, and I'm baking that detail down. Well, an easier way of doing it and taking advantage of this sort of this normal stuff that I'm talking about is by using floaters instead. So if this was my original mesh and then this is my baked mesh, and I remove, which if I just inset this a little bit for this example, and I remove everything. So I inset it so that I got a flat face around the edge there. If I view that from the top view, bearing in mind that in this example I've also turned off mesh outlines, just to preview this for you, then it looks like physically from the top, it looks the same as it being a part of the mesh. Now, I'm not suggesting you do that in an actual game. Like if you had it somewhere that was close enough that you wouldn't actually see that it isn't part of the mesh. But where it comes in handy is the baked plane for this might be above, and then when the rays are casting down, it doesn't care about that edge between them. And that's just a speed up for high poly modeling. It's nothing to do with the bevels. But if you consider sort of, if you're adding a lot of bevels to a surface and you want to do this sort of thing, you might consider separating them from the mesh and just adding some fake stuff. But technically, well, if you were doing it like that, you'd be baking onto a 2K or a 4K map, and what you're increasing there is texture memory. So you've got a low poly model with baked normals and baked textures, and all of those textures have a cost around them. So what you might consider instead is getting the same sort of detail, but using a tool like Decal Machine, or just creating your own trim sheets and creating a trim sheet to do this sort of thing. So now I've got my detail, and the speed which I added it was a lot quicker. You can add more details a lot quicker. And it looks like it's not really working because I didn't bevel those edges, but you get the idea. I can add all this kind of detail really, really quick with that method. But what I want to talk about is what you're comparing and what your trade-offs when you're doing bevels or detailed stuff on your meshes in that way. And the trade-off of doing that sort of bevel is more polygon detail, because you can see that I've already added a lot of edges. But for each of those that I'm doing, as explained earlier, there's a seam around them. So in the past, you might have had to have created a low poly model, bake down this texture information, and have that one be the one that's rendered in the distance. But here, with something like nanite and so on, it's not going to do that. It's just not going to collapse those edges. So they're never going to be collapsed and saved in the memory of the mesh in terms of how it's rendering on screen. So but what you are gaining in compared to the just baking it down onto the mesh is it's a trim sheet, so it can be shared across a whole map. And if I was just using this sort of detail everywhere that we can see on this face, with the sort of bolt inset or whatever. If I was using that across mesh, you might consider doing a detail like that, um, and saving the texture memory because it's only that small bit that's being used. It could, in that case, it could also be something above the surface, um, on a game mesh and used as like a mesh decal. And that way you're also then saving the mesh underneath from having those split edges, but you might get some mismatch and some rendering issues as sort of things crunch and overlap differently. So yes, a lot of technical details. I hope they were useful. And when it comes to picking the best type of these, a quick summary is use the weighted normal bevel pretty much most of the time. Add the extra bevel details in if it's a glancing angle or something that the player could see close up. Use these sort of trim sheet normals like we just saw and trim sheet details on a mesh that you're going to see close up, but it's also massive because you don't want to spend time modeling a massive mesh and actually making the high poly model with all these physical bevels in. Use the floaters also to save time when modeling those sort of massive meshes and so on. Careful about them getting skewed with the normals. And then bake down the mesh normals now only when necessary on a unique mesh that you need that sort of stuff. And that should pretty much be everything I can think of related to that. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next one.